almost a cliche. Like all cliches, He Waka Eke Noa it's become well known, it's become well worn, because it holds truth. In this case, it speaks to a sense of solidarity, of togetherness, particularly in tough times. But like all well-trodden phrases, it's important that we interrogate the truth that they purport to contain, to see if it still holds true. Are we really in this together? I spend quite a lot of my academic life thinking and writing about reading the Bible in the context of climate crisis. And one of the things that we often hear in this context is the idea that we're all in the same storm, He Waka Eke Noa. And in a sense, it's true. We are all experiencing the consequences of climate crisis. But we're not all in the same waka. It's important to acknowledge that we experience storms in different ways. That some people, some communities, are better resourced to face the climate crisis, while other people and communities disproportionately bear the brunt of rising sea levels and extreme weather events. How we experience the storm in this climate crisis will depend on our social, economic, ethnic, class, and gender location. And so I want to explore this idea a bit further in the context of women's solidarity and difference. Because there is a sense in which we're all in the same storm, the storm of patriarchy, misogyny, rape culture, gender violence. But our experiences of these systems is nuanced by our specific locations. Some of us navigate these systems more easily than others. In fact, some of us have even worked out how to use these systems to our advantage. And that's what I want us to think about today. So this is hopefully our journey, where we're going to go. We're going to do a little bit about thinking intersectionally, and because I'm a Bible nerd, we're going to explore some of these dynamics and how they've played out in biblical studies. And we're going to think with the biblical story of Sarah and Hagar before we come back to think about what all of this might mean for us as Anglican women today. Ka pai? Cool. Now, for some women here who've been around theological circles for quite a while, parts of this, maybe all of this, will be well known, because we're going to trace some of the whakapapa of this movement in biblical studies. But also, the issues that we as women find ourselves facing today, the storms we face, are in many ways exactly the same as those issues faced by women of our mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers' generation. And in some instances, when we look at things like inclusive language, for example, I think we've actually regressed. So it's crucial that we keep talking about these things in nuanced ways as they relate to our own contexts. So, reading the Bible looking for women. We're going to take a slight side step here and talk briefly about the whakapapa of interpreters who've read the Bible trying to look for women. Now, this is the bit that gets a bit abstract, a little bit heady, but I think it's useful and important for laying the groundwork for the Bible study that we're going to, I promise we're going to get onto. So hang in there with me. Now, as I'm sure you all know, Judaism and Christianity emerged at a time that was extremely patriarchal, and this is seen, it's reflected in both the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the early Christian writings, the Greek Bible or the New Testament. And for women who understand themselves as believing Christians and want to relate themselves to Christian traditions, the Bible presents a particular challenge. On the one hand, it's regarded as sacred scripture. It's central to the teaching and practices of the church, and it contains stories of liberation and freedom from oppression. On the other hand, in the history of Christianity, women have always suffered from discrimination and oppression because of their gender, which in turn has been based on the Bible. But we stand in a long line of women who, in different ways, have raised objections to the male-dominated tradition that we find in the Bible. So Hildegard of Bingen in the 12th century, Christine de Pizan of France in the 15th century, are two examples of learned Christian women who raised such objections and developed counter-readings of the Bible, which specifically tried to bring out, to give voice to women. At the end of the 19th century in America, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a fighter for women's rights, wrote the Women's Bible. And she kind of took the step of arguing that women were made in the image of God in the same way that men are. But it's not really until the 1970s that this kind of biblical interpretation began to find broader acceptance, particularly in the West. At first, this kind of biblical interpretation primarily focused on women characters in the Bible, particularly the matriarchs in the Old Testament, and the women who accompanied Jesus. The idea was that that our faith could be made fruitful by looking at these women, identifying with these ancient, distant figures of faith. These interpretations also focused on female presentations of God in the Bible. Attention was drawn, for example, to biblical presentations of God as mother and the Spirit as feminine. And so we have a number of fairly significant texts at this time, including Rosemary Radford Ruether's Religion and Sexism, 1974, and Phyllis Tribble's God and the Rhetoric of Sexuality, really kind of seminal, important works, still being used today. Well, I still use them in my classes today. But soon it became clear that it wasn't just Christian interpretation of the Bible that had turned the sacred text into an instrument for discrimination against women, but that the Bible itself came to be seen as an instrument of patriarchy. Some scholars noted that the Bible was predominantly written by men from a male perspective, that it's been written, transmitted, and edited and interpreted by men, that it's inherently androcentric, it's male-centered. And so feminist engagement with the Bible had to find ways of challenging this androcentric, patriarchal outlook that we find in the biblical text. So we start getting some other texts coming up, such as Phyllis Tribble's, again, Texts of Terror, again, just an absolute classic, and Elizabeth Schuster-Fiorenza's Bread Not Stone. Now, for the most part, the scholarship, groundbreaking as it was, focused on the sameness of the experience of women, both in the biblical text, but also for those women who were part of contemporary Christian communities who were reading these texts. The unspoken assumption was that all women experienced patriarchy and misogyny in the same way, and indeed could read the Bible in the same way. And so as feminist approaches to biblical studies expanded, so did the critiques of its uses, particularly from women who were not Christian, not Western, and not white. So a particular critique related to the focus on gender without sufficiently acknowledging the other categories of difference, and for the attention to patriarchy to the exclusion of other forms of oppression. So theologian Judith Plasko's piece, Anti-Judaism and Feminist Christian Interpretation, exposed the ways in which anti-Judaism is rooted in Christian thought as well as feminist Christian thought. So she points out, for example, that the idea that Jesus was a feminist sets up a negative view of Judaism and positions Jesus as distinct from and as opposed to traditional Jewish customs and beliefs, since Jesus is regarded positively against what are perceived as oppressive Jewish customs. Kwakpoelan in 93. She's an Anglican theologian, shown there. Some of you will have met her. She was in Aotearoa recently for the Anglican Indigenous Leadership Hui. She explored race and ethnicity in feminist biblical criticism, and she critiqued the single focus discussions and argued for the importance of addressing multiple oppressions in order to create a truly liberative biblical way of reading the Bible. So I just want to dwell for a few moments here on this idea of the multiple oppression, or the intersecting oppressions picked up by scholars like Puilan. And I want to talk about this idea of hierarchical dualisms, which enable what we call the logic of domination. Now, it's a little bit jargony, so I want to unpack these ideas a little bit before we kind of think about what they mean in our context and in the context of reading the Bible. So, and I think I did an online theology hui a number of months back. Time is confusing to me at the moment, where we talked about some of these ideas, so we're just going to develop that thinking a little bit. So dualistic thinking is a way of thinking that understands the world in pairs or opposites. And I've got a list there. It's not by any means exhaustive. It's just as an example. Now, clearly on one level, this kind of thinking is ridiculous. It's reductionist. It reduces everything to a simple binary. It's either or thinking. And we know that that doesn't reflect the complexity, the diversity of our world. But it's also flawed because it's hierarchically charged, meaning that everything on the so-called superior side of the pair, that's the left-hand side, is seen as having power and priority over the inferior side of the pair, on the left-hand side. So God, for example, is understood as being separate from, superior to, and having power over earth. Similarly, by this rationale, men are understood as being separate from, superior to, and as having power over women. Human beings are understood as separate from, superior to, having power over our surrounding environment. And Western civilization is understood as being separate from, superior to, and having power over non-Western and indigenous civilizations. And so from these hierarchically separated categories comes this logic of domination, which says that with superiority comes the right to rule or to dominate. And because of this kind of thinking, domination, oppression, is both justified and natural. That's how it's presented. And so we get a whole bunch of oppressions and exclusions which are justified by this unspoken but nonetheless very real logic of domination. But things get even more tricky because these two different and distinct categories, those columns there, are mutually reinforcing. So, the superior term of each pair, that column on the left again, comes to be associated with the superior term of other pairs, right? So God comes to be closely associated with maleness, the spiritual realm, the mind, whiteness, civilization, goodness, and so on. And this is true for the inferior terms as well, those on the right-hand column. Women come to be closely associated with earth, the physical realm, animals, the body, uncivilization, indigeneity, and so on. And because these connections are mutually reinforcing, the presence of one of these terms on the inferior side of the dualism both reinforces and is reinforced by its association with the other terms. Okay, so the feminization of earth, understanding earth as female, reinforces earth's place on the inferior side of the dualistic pairings, and the environmentalization of women, thinking of women in earthy terms, reinforces women's place on the inferior side of the dualistic pairing. So it's a really vicious and violent cycle. It's a complex and pervasive web of interlocking relationships of power and oppression. And what we see here is that oppressions are not isolated. They are interlinked and they have to be seen together. And these structures of thought, in the West at least, combine to form implicit systems of belief which are reflected in our attitudes and in our behaviour, in our theologies and in our biblical interpretations. But things become even more complex where some women come to be more closely associated with the superior side of the dualistic hierarchies, when some of their other identity markers are associated with the so-called superior side. So women who are white, straight, and able-bodied, for example, are understood to be more closely aligned with the superior side of the binary pairs, and therefore, in some contexts, they assume the logic of domination and hierarchical superiority. Women, and indeed men, whose other identity markers are located on the inferior side of the pairing, experience multiple forms of oppression. So, within this model, we see not only the tendency of male over female domination, but also many different levels of domination rooted in race, class, sexual orientation, and so on. And we see this lived out in structures of domination like racism, heterosexism, classism, colonialism, and so on. This means that elite women may be in a position where they exercise power over other women and also other men based on factors like race, ethnicity, class, or sexual orientation. And so this has led some scholars to suggest that it's too simplistic, it's too limiting, to just talk about isolated oppressions such as patriarchy. Patriarchy doesn't reflect, it doesn't capture the complex levels of oppression that work at the intersections of gender and race and class and sexual orientation and age that make up the contemporary landscape. So Carol Myers, for example, argues that different power structures can exist simultaneously in any given society, with each structure having its own hierarchical arrangements that may cross-cut each other laterally. And so we'll see, and we'll see this in the Bible study that we're about to do, that women in the Bible are not just portrayed as helpless victims, but quite often are in a position of exercising a measure of control and agency, at times over others. So an intersectional approach, where we're thinking about the complexity of those dualisms and the logic of domination, an intersectional approach helps us think about the interlocking systems of power that affect those who are most marginalized. And out of this intersectional kind of thinking, a more recent interpretive movement has emerged, which is known as womanist biblical interpretation. And I just want to highlight Tekwene. Can you just stand up and wave for a minute, Tekwene? Because Tekwene is an utterly incredible womanist biblical scholar, and I just want to, say you're amazing, and please keep doing what you're doing, and thank you. So, as I hope you all know, womanism distinguishes itself from the dominant culture feminism, which is all too often distorted by racism and classism, and marginalizes women of colour. And so it brings into focus the multi-layered and interlocking systems of oppression and works towards ending these multi-dimensional oppressions. So that was the intense kind of theory bit. You'll be glad to know that's over, and that we can get on with reading the Bible. But this is really, I think it's really, really important to have that framework, and we're going to bring it to our reading of the text. So that's going to shape the way that we think about the story of Sarah and Hagar in Genesis chapter 16 and Genesis chapter 21. Our reading is going to be helped by some insights drawn from the work of a womanist biblical scholar known as Will Gaffney, who's an utterly exceptional biblical scholar. I want at this point to give a trigger warning. We will be discussing enslavement, we will be discussing rape and sexual exploitation, not in graphic detail, but these will be mentioned. So please take care as you engage with this material, and if you need to take a moment, ka pai. So what I'm going to, what's the time? Cool, 7:30. What I'm going to do is, you've each got a text. It's not quite fitting on the screen, but that's all good. I printed 70 copies, so I feel like there should be enough. If there's not, just share with the person next to you, because I'm hoping that there'll be some space to read and to think about these texts in small groups. So, this is where you get to do some of the work, and I get to not do some of the work. So what I'd like you to do, first of all, is turn to your text and read Genesis chapter 16, verses 1 to 4a, just the beginning of verse 4. I've split it into a paragraph so you'll be able to see where to stop. Couple of questions. What do we know about Hagar? What do we know about Sarai or Sarah? So take a couple of minutes. We'll take 3 or 4 minutes. 5 minutes. We'll take 5 minutes. Read this text together and have a think about these questions. Don't be shy. Turn to the person next to you and have a conversation with them. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together. There'll be lots of time throughout this to have conversations. So, just a couple of, what are a couple of things that you noticed in this text? What do we know about Hagar? What do we know about Sarah? Do you just want to call out a couple of thoughts?
2 points, that Sarah had already been prostituted by Abraham twice.
Yeah.
So she was trying to keep her dignity.
Okay.
Somehow.
Yep.
Anyhow.
Yep. Yep, and I think it's, Genesis 12? Yep. 12 and 20, yep. What else do we know?
She's powerful too.
Who is? Sarah, yeah. Yep, has a degree of power. Yep. Anything else?
No regard towards any damage to anybody else as long as she gets what she wants.
Okay, yeah. Yep. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yep. So society playing a part, and the social expectations for women to have children. Yeah. Cool.
We can't hear the comments that people
Okay. Cool.
So I'm wondering if we can either have the microphone or just you repeat everything.
Yep. I'm happy to repeat.
Testing.
Cool. Cool.
I guess in this text it just shows that the positioning of women are different.
Yeah.
They're both women, but they've both got quite different roles in society, and their social status is quite different too.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, one last one, because we need to...
People could use this to justify, like, selling their daughters to someone else in arranged marriage.
Okay, yeah.
With the Tupton, Hagar was just a girl, therefore she was probably a virgin, and she was a child, she was a girl.
Yep, we're not... Yeah, she was probably young, yeah, yep. Okay. I think we've picked up on most of these points, but just a few things from me. So for me, when I read the text, Hagar's a really vulnerable person. And she's, if we think about our columns, she's marked by 3 intersecting identity markers. So firstly, she's a woman living in a patriarchal world. She's a foreign woman. So she's born in Egypt. And she's an enslaved woman, so she would have been considered the property of her enslavers. Now, her Egyptian ethnicity and her enslaved status, if you read the text, gets mentioned more than once in these verses. The narrator seems to really want to focus on these features of her identity. I think it's interesting that we're not really given any other details about who she is, other than the fact that she came from Egypt. So, how old was she? Does she have any family back in Egypt? Does she ever get homesick? How did she feel about Abraham and Sarai at this point, bringing her to the land of Canaan?
But wasn't that part of the parcel in those days? And that was how all such young enslaved persons were. And so the guy was just doing what was ordinary.
Yep. But we're still not given any of that information about her, regardless of whether or not it's a socially acceptable practice at the time. Can you ask the question again? Can we come to that in a moment? Because we're not quite up to that, because we're going to take the little chunks of text, because that's a really good question. Can we go back a slide, because we're not quite finished. There's that quote there on the bottom from James Okoye talks about some of that context. So he says, Hagar is seen as a possession, a disposable commodity that can exchange hands at the will of the owner. She does not need to be asked what she feels about the arrangement. Her feelings are of no consequence in the transaction. In the entire narrative, Sarah never speaks directly to Hagar. So we don't get any insights into how she's feeling at this point of the story. The editors and authors of the text don't seem to care particularly for that. Interestingly, though, there's a rabbinic midrash, a commentary, that tries to answer some of these questions that go unanswered in the text. So the rabbinic midrash, can we move to the next slide? Sorry. Yeah, I'm hoping, if you keep going. Yep, keep going one. Thank you, yep. That tries to answer, so the midrash suggests that Hagar's subordination was compensation for Sarah's subordination to the Pharaoh who bought her from Abraham. So that's a reference to, I think someone made a comment over here, where Sarai gets, she's passed off by Abraham as his sister in order that he protects himself. And so this rabbinic midrash offers this as an explanation. So basically it's a woman for a woman. So in this midrashic reading, Hagar was the Pharaoh's daughter. And so that's one of the explanations that the rabbis gave for the reasoning for her enslavement. Now, there are two Hebrew terms used to describe the status of Hagar, shifcha and amah. And these words seem to be used interchangeably, often translated as maid or maidservant. But Will Gaffney points out that Hagar is not a maid or a maidservant. She's not paid for her service, she's enslaved. And we need to make that distinction clear in the way that we translate these texts. Because the word maid or maidservant really kind of conceals or whitewashes the violence that's inherent in these structures of enslavement. So Hagar is completely other. And her otherness is at the heart of her portrayal in this text. Can we go to the next one? Yeah, cool, thank you. Her name, Hagar, is not actually her name at all. At least we don't think so. Hagar literally means the foreigner, or the alien, the sojourner, in biblical Hebrew. So the alien who resides in a land that's not her own. Now, I think clearly, the name Hagar was not given to her by her parents. It seems really unlikely that an Egyptian mother would name their child alien or the foreigner in the language of the people to whom she's going to be subjugated. Interestingly, and this is just a bit of an aside, when Hagar appears in Islamic traditions, she's known as Hajar, and that word doesn't derive from alien or stranger at all. It actually means splendid and nourishing. So different, same person, different tradition. So, again, conversations in small groups. Let's have a think about our dualistic pairings. What are Hagar's identity markers? What are Sarah's identity markers? What are the power dynamics in this relationship? And I don't think it's clear cut. So have a talk, share with the people around you. Okay, I'm sorry to rush you because I think it sounds like there are really great discussions going on. Again, just 2 or 3 insights from around the room. What are some of the things that came up for you in your discussion?
Thanks, Emily. We mentioned the same ones that we had on the board before, that Hagar is a woman, a foreigner, a slave. But we also just added a child, because there's also a certain element of other vulnerability when you're a child, you haven't matured yet.
Yep.
And so, yeah, that contributes to the vulnerability in that for her.
Absolutely. There's an age disparity there as well, hey? Yep. Over here.
Hagar also birthed Abraham's heir. So an identity marker there is she's the biological mother of his son,
Yeah,
Ishmael.
she's fertile. She can bear children, and that carries weight in patriarchal societies.
And we were talking about, just from a Māori perspective, that actually she still holds some mana. She's the puhi of a pharaoh. So,
well, maybe. In the rabbinic tradition she is. In the Midrashic tradition. We don't know. I mean, again, the text doesn't tell us that, but that's one explanation. Yeah.
Having just seen the Egyptian exhibition up here, I'm wondering if the fact that she is Egyptian also makes her really high status, because it was a very highly developed culture.
Okay.
With far more material goods, I suspect, than the Israelites.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering if she's like a pretty high value chattel.
Yeah, and I mean, again, the text doesn't tell us, but maybe. One of the things that we're going to see is that there's some really interesting parallels between the Sarah and Hagar. Sarah is Egyptian, Hagar is Egyptian, Sarah is kind of the proto-Israelite, and that relationship between those two peoples, yeah. Okay, I'm going to keep us moving just to make sure, well, again, I think we've covered lots of these things. So the text makes it clear to us that Hagar has no say over her body. She's given to Abraham, or her child will be given to Sarah. So she's kind of on the underside of all of those power curves that are at play. She's female, she's foreign, she's enslaved, she's a child. Her one source of power is that she's fertile, but she lacks the autonomy over her own fertility. So she doesn't even have control over that. Sarah, on the other hand...
Is she kind of like a surrogate? Would Sarah be able to take Ishmael and bring him up as her own?
Is it like a surrogate, like today's world? Would Sarah had ever been able to take Hagar's baby and bring it up as her own?
Yeah, well, that's the idea, is that Hagar will nurse it and Sarah will bring it up as her own. I think there are some... I'm a little bit hesitant to make that parallel, because in theory, contemporary surrogacy situations, there's consent. Whereas I don't think that there's consent in this. And don't get me wrong, I think in contemporary surrogacy situations, there are also questions, difficulties of vulnerability.
So it was always assumed that if Hagar had the baby, it would be her child?
No, so it won't be her child. So it will be Abraham and
Sarah's
child.
child.
Yeah. So Sarah is a freeborn woman. She would have enjoyed a certain amount of social privilege being Abraham's wife. At the same time, though, Sarah is trapped within a patriarchal system where her social power is limited and her status is lowered by her ongoing infertility. So both of these factors may have led her to believe that using Hagar to bear Abraham's child is the only thing that she can do. Now, I don't think this in any way excuses Sarah for compelling Hagar into a forced marriage and forced pregnancy, but it might help us understand why she did it. The other thing that we've touched on, which is important, I think, in terms of understanding Sarah, is that on two separate occasions, Abraham passes Sarah off as his sister, and so as a result, she's taken temporarily into a local ruler's harem. And so basically, Abraham's worried that Sarai's beauty will attract the attention of local men who might be willing to kill him in order to claim her for themselves. So Abraham's ruse works to protect him, but only by sacrificing Sarah's own safety. So Sarah will have learned from these two occasions that women's bodies are expendable if they serve male interests. Again, I don't think this justifies what Sarah does to Hagar, but it helps us to understand her motivations. So she, in some ways, is also a victim of the patriarchal world in which she lives. But at the same time, she is willing to use the patriarchal system of enslavement to her own advantage, even when it means inflicting pretty horrific abuse onto another woman in her own household, which we'll look at right now in the following verses. So, have a look. We're just looking at these snippets of verses. So it's the next paragraph down, Genesis 16, 4b to 6. What's going on between Sarah and Hagar? Why does each character respond the way they do? So again, take a few minutes, have a conversation, and then we'll come back to the main group. Okay, there seems to be a bit of a lull in the conversation, so I'm going to take advantage of that. Any thoughts or comments that you want to add here in terms of these verses? Sorry, we need a microphone because we can't hear. Aroha mai.
Thank you. I'm just reading the text, you can see the power of women between Hagar and Sarai, what Hagar can do, and what Sarai was doing to Abraham. She used Hagar as part of her power, erecting her status for being infertile.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you can see, I think the emphasis here again of being the Egyptian slave and Sarai being a free, you sort of see a different story, a different side of it. They're both women, but they are from both different contexts.
Yeah.
Have experienced being enslaved by Egyptians. Now it's the other way around. Sarah is actually doing the same thing to Hagar.
That story will come next, but yeah.
Yeah, and at the same time, you also look at the experience of Sarai and how she used that in order to influence Abraham by using Hagar.
Yeah.
So I think that's we actually use the women's power for her own good rather than standing together as women.
Kia ora. There's an interesting piece here where in that first section, Hagar is actually described at one point now as Abraham's wife. So she's moved from being maidservant to wife. And then in this section, he sort of gives up. So her status of coming under his protection is relinquished, and she's back to her previous status as an enslaved possession of Sarai, and then that language around, brutalization, which is that same language that is used for the Israelites when they're down in Egypt. Like I was saying, I think we miss how bad that treatment is because we don't understand that is actually brutalization.
Yeah, and we'll touch on that in a moment. That word there, I think, in the first section is pilagesh, so it's not actually to describe Hagar. It's not even really wife. It's maybe secondary wife at best, but our English translation, I think, kind of struggles to capture.
But there's
something.
certainly
But
a
there's
change in her
difference.
status.
The wording is different. Yeah,
and in
absolutely.
terms of who actually has ownership and protection over her.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So, and let's have a look at the way that Hagar's attitude, at least the way that Hagar frames her, the way that the story frames Hagar's attitude towards Sarai. The word in Hebrew is to curse or to hold worthless, something that is light or nothing. And I don't know about you, but I was brought up thinking that, or interpreting this passage in a way that, Hagar sees Sarah as nothing because Sarah is infertile and Hagar is fertile. So that was the issue. Read from a womanist perspective, Will Gaffney argues that maybe Hagar regards Sarah as nothing or curses her because Sarah, as we've just said, uses Hagar's body for her own reproductive purposes. So in an ancient patriarchal context, Hagar's fertility was likely her only source of power, but Sarah has taken control of that and used it to her advantage. So Will Gaffney suggests that Hagar is angry that Sarah has orchestrated this whole situation and is now forcing her to carry the child of this arrangement. So Will Gaffney asks, why should a sex slave be forced into growing someone else's child and then think highly or bless her enslaver? And perhaps the text singles out Hagar's feelings towards Sarah because she sees Sarah as primarily responsible for her subjugation. Will Gaffney reads in this text Abraham's complicity as being secondary. So as we've noted, Sarah is free, she has some social privilege, but she's still an infertile woman in this patriarchal world, which does put her at risk. And she, as you said, tries to restore her status on and in Hagar's body. In fact, there's a sense that Sarah perpetuates those patriarchal values that oppress her by deliberately seizing Hagar's body, her fertility, and using them for her own benefit. So then Sarah continues her domination of Hagar in anger. First she takes her anger out on Abraham, then she calls on God to do justice on her behalf. God remains silent, Abraham removes himself from the situation, and so Sarah takes her anger out on Hagar. And as Miriam, I think you mentioned, she brutalizes Hagar. The word that is used there in the Hebrew, Sarah's oppression of Hagar, is the same that the word that is used is the same as the word that's used to speak of Egypt's oppression of Israel in Exodus. And we'll come back to that relationship a little bit later. So we read that Sarah treats Hagar harshly, Hagar runs away. So, next slide, hopefully. Cool. And we're going to read the next bit of the text, which is verses 7 to 10. And I think we're getting a bit tight on time now. So read the text together, have some conversation, and we'll keep going. Okay, let's come back together as a group. Any thoughts or reflections on these verses? Kelly.
This is the first time in the narrative that we hear the voice of Hagar, and so that's amazing. I think the power dynamics is changing a lot. In a lot of ways, she has, in the previous section, when she decided to run away from Sarai, now she's made the deliberate choice to run away, and in that sense, depriving the master of the privilege of having an offspring.
Okay.
Also, the angel talks to the slave girl, and it resonates to the promise that the Lord made to Abraham in Genesis 12 and 15.
Yeah.
Whereas this message has not come to Sarai, but to Hagar, the slave girl. So
Yeah.
that's a really interesting change in power dynamics there. And there is a direct communication between the angel and Hagar.
Yes.
So yeah, these are a few thoughts. A lot can be said.
Cool, thank you. I think Nyasha had something. Did you want to pass the mic up?
What we were asking here, was why is this angel asking as if the angel doesn't know what's happening in the future?
Okay.
And then we also thought maybe the angel is saying, where do you think you are going? You're going to die out there.
Yeah. Yep.
If you read this from a different country, like there's probably places where they still culturally live like this, and yeah, that was just the cultural thinking at the time. And it probably still is in places.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to be, I think we need to be just kind of careful with that, because the same kind of structures that scaffold what's happening here, like patriarchy and enslavement and so on, I mean, these are still structures that structure our society today. And as we'll talk about hopefully a little bit, I mean, enslavement is by no means a thing of the past. So I'm careful to say, oh, this just happened back then, because I think that lets the texts off too easily. And I think we can be critical about those same systems that are operational in our contexts today. One more, and then we're going to keep going.
Hagar that she needs to submit. She needs to submit to this violence. It sounds very much like a husband speaking to his wife. A more sort of patriarchal approach to things.
Yeah.
That if you submit to this violence, in the long run it will be okay. And I struggle with that. So it almost feels as if Abraham has written this narrative, or it's been put into his words, his explanation of things.
Yeah, and is this the angel? But the angel's speaking in the first person, right? So the angel's almost speaking on behalf of God. And I think you're right. The message that the angel is giving to Hagar is pretty disturbing. She must return to Sarah, and she needs to submit to the violent and vicious abuse. So I'm worried that the text here is endorsing or sanctioning her enslavement. So in these verses, yep.
What stood out to me was A, that the angel of the Lord found her, so presumably the angel went out looking.
Okay.
So presumably God sent the angel as like on a rescue mission, and perhaps it was only through returning that she would be saved and her child would be saved.
Yeah.
I would also say that she's not being asked to submit to violence, she's being asked to submit back to her mistress. Now, her mistress's former treatment had been harsh, but it's not necessarily a given that she's being told, go back and be brutalized again. She's just being told, go back and submit.
Yeah. I think you can argue that. For me, that kind of downplays the seriousness of the violence that Hagar has been experiencing, her ongoing enslavement, her sexual subjugation, her abuse at the hands of Sarah. Yeah, I think we need to be careful about, or at least need to be critical about the way that the text maybe has the potential to endorse systems of domination and oppression through the instruction to submit. One last one, because we're going to run out of time.
I was just going to say that. Number 10 actually, like going back to Hagar, that number 10 actually confirms that for Hagar that there's a brighter future. And number 10 actually says that he, it will be greatly multiplied by your offspring, that they cannot be counted for multitudes. So
yeah.
It's a better future.
Yeah, and that's the first time that Hagar, she receives this kind of divine annunciation. She's the first woman in the Bible to receive the divine annunciation, the promise of a child, the promise of a dynasty. She'll become the mother of many peoples. And we might, Deb, if we can move on to the next slide. I think we've just, yep. We'll read verses 13 to 16. So you're more than welcome to read the next bit, but we're going to skip down to 13 to 16, and again have a quick discussion about those verses. Okay, let's come back together. And we're going to have 2 comments. Because I can't say no to all of the incredible insights, so I'm going to say 2 comments right now, so you know the rules. Wait, one over here. Where's the mic? Oh, thank you. Jenny.
My comment in this passage, I think I see how Hagar was going through a storm and being a foreigner, but she knew who God was through those conversations she had with the angels. And she knew that power too, that she actually called or named God, and he listens to her through this. And I think that's what I get from. And it also represents how God was being quiet throughout this situation. Okay. But this passage sort of tells us his promise was still there, and he was still listening, and he was going to exalt that promise he gave for Abraham, but through these 2 women. And
okay, cool, thank you. There was one other comment over here, and then that's it.
Thank you. I think just 2. No, I think I was loud enough. Sorry, I thought I was loud enough. But just number 1 for us, we thought it was interesting that because we skipped 11 and 12, the angel actually told Hagar that her son will be called Ishmael. Yep. But in this passage that we read, Abram named his son, which I believe is sort of like God's plan. He already had a plan, and even though he told Hagar, Abram was included in his plan without us knowing. And secondly, sorry, don't come at us, but it was an interesting point. 86 years old, and we thought, don't lose hope. 86-year-old, and they've still got it. So yeah, thank you.
Kia ora. Thank you. Cool. So a couple of things to further pick up on. Hagar names, hang on, sorry Deb, before we get to that, Hagar names God here. You are El Roy, the God of seeing, God who sees me. Now this is extraordinary because in Exodus 33 we'll learn that no one can see God and live. So it's hugely significant because it makes Hagar the only person in the Bible to give God a personal name, so clearly she's a hugely significant figure. On the other hand, again, I think we should be a little bit troubled that the name Hagar gives to God, being El Roy, God who sees, and what does God see? Does he see a woman who has been abused? And just being kind of careful about that dynamic of, despite seeing abuse, still being told to return to abusive situations. So I think there's a whole mixture of nuances to what's going on in the text there. What we're going to do, because we're running out of time, is I want to just return to that point that someone picked up on earlier, and some of the parallels between the Exodus narrative and the Hebrew people who were oppressed under Egyptian domination and who escaped into the desert. And so we find in Hagar's journey repeatedly into the desert, which will eventually take her back to Egypt at the end of the story, as you all know, is we find this kind of inversion of stories. So Hagar the Egyptian is abused by Sarah the proto-Israelite, like Israel is abused by Egypt. Hagar escapes into the wilderness, Israel escapes into the wilderness. Ultimately, Hagar will head towards Egypt in the same way that Israel heads away from Egypt. And so in the end, there is something of a happy ending, as you'll know because you know the broader arc of the story, that Hagar leaves her enslavement, she goes back to Egypt. But I'm hoping that one of the things that this story really draws out for us is that gender is only one mark of identity that causes inequity and oppression. So a person's social status, their ethnicity, their race, their class, their able-bodiedness, their age can intersect and sustain power imbalances and lead to various forms of oppression, including oppression perpetrated by women against more vulnerable women. And I think Hagar and Sarah's story highlights the importance of recognizing the intersecting aspects of inequity and oppression. So, Deb, I think we're skipping. Yep. Cool. Yep, keep going. Cool. Yep, that's where we're up to. Cool. So, I want to move from text to context, so biblical text to our context. On one level, Hagar's story can help us open up conversations about contemporary women's experiences of enslavement. And Hagar's experience can help us understand how intersecting layers of oppression can make some women and girls incredibly vulnerable to enslavement. And as we've noted, the same ideologies that support and scaffold enslavement in the biblical world, patriarchy, imperialism, racial supremacy, class privilege, still remain really powerful presence structures in our contemporary world. So these are far from things of the past. In a recent report, which was issued in 2021 by the International Labour Organization, it estimated that at least 50 million people are currently experiencing enslavement, including 28 million people enslaved in forced labour, 22 million into forced marriages. Women and children make up around 70% of the people currently enslaved. We should also remember that modern enslavement isn't something that happens in remote parts of the world. It occurs in almost every country globally. It affects people of different ethnic, cultural and religious contexts. More than half of all forced labour and a quarter of all forced marriages occur in upper, middle income or high income countries. So this is here as well. So her story should focus us on the plight of women in our own societies who are enslaved and trafficked. And in a sense, for Will Gaffney, for example, Hagar becomes the mother of women and men who endure cycles of abuse at the hands of oppressors. And so, as we view Hagar with new eyes, so we're asked to confront these injustices within our own communities and consider the ways in which we turn a blind eye or we don't see those experiences that are in front of us. On another level, though, Sarah's complicated relationship with Abraham and Sarah can be read as examples of the complicated relationships between women and men across lines of privilege and hierarchy. We see how our dualisms might not be as clear-cut as they're often presented. Power and domination is more nuanced, more complex, more blurry, more tricky. So yes, Abraham's use of Sarah has resonances with the sexual and reproductive uses of women's bodies across time, but also Sarah's actions evoke both complicity with dominant male abuse of subordinate women and the independent abusive actions of dominant culture women against subordinated women. So, where does that leave us? With about 5 minutes, hopefully. One of the things I hope we've highlighted today is the interconnected nature of oppression. So we see that the oppression of women is entangled with the oppression of Indigenous communities, with the oppression of people on the communities on the basis of class and disability and sexuality and age and so on, with the oppression of earth. These are interconnected, mutually reinforcing structures that work to give power and privilege to few at the expense of many. So one of the things, I think the thing that I want to end on is the idea of practicing, decolonizing our minds in our gender discourses and practicing radical planetary solidarity. So planetary solidarity is the celebration of our planetary relationality. Women, men, people of all genders, animals, plants, water bodies, minerals, celebrating our togetherness. Enlarging the African concept of Ubuntu, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who we heard about earlier, developed the notion of planetary Ubuntu. Practicing planetary Ubuntu means to widen and deepen the circle and act with love to all that we are, to our entire community, to our extended planetary being. I am because you are, we are because the planet is. Planetary solidarity isn't a romantic notion or a utopian idea. It's a resolve to become a life-flourishing community. It entails the discernment and commitment to identify interlocking systems of oppression that deepen the vulnerability of the marginalized. And it calls for the courage and creativity to develop alternatives to the prevailing orders. Cynthia Molobida talks about planetary solidarity as, she says, it entails seeing systems evil for what they are, seeing systemic evil for what it is and acknowledging it, resisting it, and creating more just alternatives. I think that's where we'll stop. Thank you.
Ngā mihi nui ki a koe hoa, Dr. Emily. What a blessing it has been for us to have a taste in the feast of your scholarship this evening. Thank you so much. I'm sure all of us will agree with me that what you have taken us through in this session has been amazing, stirred in us the curiosity to read biblical narratives and wonder what else.
Study theology.
What else is in the text? What else, or what other things are hidden? So we are encouraged to always read with suspicion, aren't we? Thank you for that amazing exercise. If I may also add this, if you aren't already following the Bloody Bible podcast, does anyone? Probably some of you already know. Yes, the Bible, the Bloody Bible. That's Dr. M and Dr. Caroline Blythe, a very raving review, amazing, very engaging, very informative, well-researched podcast on biblical. You should speak it. No. Crime and violence in biblical texts, but engaging with the narratives from women's perspective. It's amazing, so please follow that and listen. So on behalf of all of us here, thank you so much for your whakaaro, for your wisdom, for the passion, for your scholarship, and we've just been so blessed and enriched. So thank you. And we pray that God, wisdom, Sophia herself, continue to guide you and bless you, and that you, in who you are and all you do, you will continue to shine God's glory. Bless you and bless your family.
Okay, we thought if we say let's have supper and come back for night prayer, maybe it will just be me and Bridie praying. So while we are here, before we can all move on, let's just say night prayer.
We don't have prayer books, so if you have it on your phone or if you know it in your mind, please bring it up. Or go sit next to someone who has it on their phone. Sorry. Unfortunately, we do not have hard copy prayer books. So if you can bring night prayer up on your phone or sit next to someone who has it on their phone, or if you're one of those amazing people who knows it all off by heart.
Oh, is there?
Thank you, Scott.
I just want to acknowledge the Bible study that we've gone through this evening. So thank you, Emily. Tomorrow morning we have the presentation by Cheryl Thompson and Vicky Terrell. Cheryl has asked if we could do the presentation in the morning in the hall, because it's going to be really interactive. And she's asked if you could read the paper that was in your pack on disability. Oh. Yeah. The theology of disability that's in your pack.
On disability.
Okay, so they've asked if you could read that this evening in preparation for their session tomorrow morning. Thank you, Wahinema.
So we might just all take a deep breath in and out and still ourselves before our God. The angels of God guard us through the night. The Spirit of God be our guide. It is but lost labour that we haste to rise up early, and so late take rest, and eat the bread of anxiety. For those beloved of God are given gifts even while they sleep.
Etifano, my brothers and sisters, our hope, our help is in the name of the eternal God,
who is making the heavens and the earth.
Dear God, thank you for all that is good, for our creation and for our humanity, for the stewardship you have given us of this planet Earth, for the gifts of life and of one another, for your love which is unbounded and eternal. O thou most holy and beloved, my companion, my guide upon the way, Taku fetu marama, ete tepo, my bright evening star. We repent the wrongs we have done.
Oh God.
We have wounded your love.
O God, heal us.
We stumble in the darkness.
Light of the world, transfigure us.
We forget that we are your home.
Spirit of God, dwell in us.
Eternal Spirit, living God, in whom we live and move and have our being. All that we are, have been, and shall be is known to you, to the very secret of our hearts, and all that rises to trouble us. Living flame, burn into us. Cleansing wind, blow through us. Fountain of water, well up within us, that we may love and praise in deed and in truth.
Eternal Spirit, flow through our being and open our lips,
that our mouths may proclaim your praise.
Let us worship the God of love.
Alleluia, alleluia. Psalm 134. We, your servants, bless you, O God, as we stand by night in your house. We lift up our hands towards the holy place and give you thanks and praise. Bless us from all places where you dwell, O God, creator of the heavens and the earth.
We thought it would be good if we finish off the reading that Emily started, and so we will end on a good note. From verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. But Sarah saw the son of Hagar the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, playing with her son Isaac. So she said to Abraham, "Cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not inherit along with my son Isaac." The matter was very distressing to Abraham on account of his son. But God said to Abraham, "Do not be distressed because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for it is through Isaac that offspring shall be named after you. As for the son of the slave woman, I will make a nation of him also, because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. When the water in the skin was gone, she cast the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him.